It was supposed to be just another routine flight. A long-haul journey from New York to Los Angeles, with passengers settling in, the seatbelt signs buzzing off, and the familiar hum of the plane's engines taking over the cabin. But what happened next was anything but routine. In fact, it was an incident so shocking, so unexpected, that it would send shockwaves through the entire airline industry. This wasn't just a tale of customer service gone wrong. It was a story of prejudice, power, and a hard lesson learned in the most humbling way imaginable. Picture this. A young boy, around 10 years old, is sitting quietly in his seat. He's excited for the flight, eagerly looking out the window, with a tablet in his hands, maybe watching cartoons or playing games. He's just another passenger, another face among many, blending in with the crowd. But then, the flight attendant, let's call her Karen, approaches. At first, it seems like a simple interaction. She asks the boy if he needs anything, but the tone in her voice is sharp, condescending even. She's already making assumptions, sizing him up. After all, why would a child, especially a black child, deserve the same respect as everyone else? What happens next will leave you speechless. The boy, who's only trying to enjoy the flight, speaks up in a soft but clear voice. He asks her to please move his drink out of the way, but the flight attendant's patience has already run thin. Without warning, and with an attitude that oozes contempt, she slaps him, hard, right across the face. It's a moment that lasts far too long, and for everyone witnessing it, it's one they'll never forget. The shock in the boy's eyes, the stunned silence that follows. It's as if the whole plane holds its breath, unsure of what to do next. But here's where the story takes a dramatic twist. As the flight continues, whispers spread through the cabin. The boy's father, it turns out, isn't just some random passenger. He's the CEO of the very airline they're flying on. The same man who has poured his heart and soul into building this company, someone who has worked tirelessly to provide jobs and opportunities for people from all walks of life. But most importantly, he's the boy's father, and no one, not even a flight attendant, has the right to treat his son like that. The tension starts to rise, and you can practically feel the eyes of the other passengers shifting. The flight attendant has no idea who she's just slapped. She's going about her business, trying to maintain some level of composure, not realizing the storm that's about to hit her. What she doesn't know is that her actions are about to come back to haunt her in the most unforgiving way. After the incident, the boy's father calmly stands up, his demeanor calm, but his presence commanding. He walks over to the flight attendant's station, where Karen is still trying to hide her nerves behind a professional smile. She doesn't recognize him immediately, but he recognizes her. His eyes lock onto hers, and there's a silence that hangs between them, one that speaks volumes. What follows is a confrontation so intense that the entire cabin falls silent, listening to every word. You could cut the tension with a knife as the flight attendant begins to realize the gravity of her mistake. But it's too late for apologies. This is no ordinary passenger. This is someone who holds the power to change her life forever. The question on everyone's mind: how will the flight attendant handle the fallout from her actions? How will she live with the consequences of her decisions? Stay tuned, because what happens next is something you won't believe. From corporate boardrooms to the skies above, the fallout from this encounter is far from over. And trust me, you'll want to know how this story unfolds. It's a tale of karma, a reminder that actions have consequences, especially when you least expect them. What happens when someone with power, someone who has the ability to make things right, steps in to hold someone accountable for their mistakes? So, keep watching, because in just a few moments, we're about to dive deep into what happens when a racist flight attendant learns the hard way that not every passenger is as ordinary as they seem. And trust me, you won't want to miss the shocking twist that no one saw coming. As the seconds ticked by, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was on the flight attendant, Karen, who stood at the galley, nervously pretending to arrange her drink cart as if nothing had happened. But her face betrayed her. Her usually pale complexion had turned a shade of red that was hard to miss, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the overhead compartments, her eyes flicking around the plane, avoiding contact with the other passengers. She had no idea that the boy's father was sitting just a few rows back, looking calm, but his mind was racing. It wasn't the first time he had encountered an incident like this on his airline, but this one hit differently. His son had been through so much in his life. He was smart, kind-hearted, and talented, but far too often, He had to deal with unfair treatment because of the color of his skin. This time, though, it wasn't just some random stranger or ignorant passenger making a hurtful comment. This time, it was someone in a position of authority. Someone who should have known better. The man's name was Marcus Carter, the CEO of one of the country's most successful airlines. Carter Airlines was known for its luxury service, its commitment to customer care, and its diversity initiatives. He had built the company from the ground up, and he took great pride in the way his airline treated every single passenger, regardless of their background or appearance. He often spoke publicly about creating an inclusive environment, where everyone was welcome, and everyone was treated equally. And yet, here was his son, a 10-year-old child, being humiliated in front of dozens of people by someone who was supposed to embody the company's values. It wasn't the first time Marcus had been confronted with racial prejudice in his life, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But this moment was different. His son, Xavier, had been subjected to enough microaggressions, enough subtle insults and dismissive glances, that Marcus had made it a point to instill confidence in him. No one's opinion of you matters more than your own, Marcus always told him. But when people cross the line, you stand up for yourself. Marcus glanced at his son, who was sitting quietly in his seat, still holding the tablet in his hands. Xavier hadn't said a word after the slap. He hadn't cried, hadn't shouted, or tried to fight back. Instead, he just sat there, stunned. His wide eyes locked on his father's face, silently seeking reassurance. Marcus could feel the weight of his son's gaze, the pressure to protect him, to make this right. But what could he do? He was the CEO of an airline, not a superhero. He was a father, though, and that meant he had to protect his son in any way he could. And right now, that meant confronting the flight attendant who had just made the worst mistake of her life. With a sigh, Marcus stood up, his 6'2" frame towering over the seats. He moved calmly but decisively down the aisle, his footsteps the only sound in the otherwise still cabin. As he approached the galley, he could see Karen's nervous fidgeting grow more pronounced. She was pretending to inspect the coffee supplies, but he could tell she was avoiding him, avoiding his gaze. She knew. When Marcus finally reached the galley, she looked up at him, her face paling even further. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. It was as though her brain was struggling to catch up with the situation she found herself in. "Excuse me, miss," Marcus said, his voice steady but low. "I need you to come with me." Karen swallowed hard. She could feel the sweat beginning to bead on her forehead, the adrenaline rush hitting her all at once. She had no idea who this man was, but there was something in his tone that made her stomach churn. Maybe it was the controlled anger in his voice, or maybe it was the way he carried himself. Like someone who had dealt with far worse than a slap to a child and wasn't going to back down. She hesitated for just a moment, then nodded slowly, taking a small step forward. "Of course, sir," she managed to say, but even her words lacked the confidence they usually held. They walked down the aisle in silence, past rows of passengers who were now watching the scene unfold. Some were whispering to each other, others just stared, trying to figure out what was going on. A few noticed the boy in the seat, his expression still unreadable. It wasn't every day that a confrontation like this took place on a flight. When they reached the back of the plane, Marcus stopped by the crew rest area, his eyes now locked onto Karen's. He wasn't about to make this easy for her. "You slapped my son," he said, his voice still calm but laced with authority. "And I want to know why." Karen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She quickly glanced back toward the cockpit, where the pilots were likely oblivious to what was happening behind the scenes. She knew she couldn't escape this now, she had gone too far. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice quivering. "It was just a reflex." He was being difficult. Difficult? Marcus interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. "Difficult? You slapped a 10-year-old child because he asked you to move his drink?" He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I don't care how you feel about him. I don't care what assumptions you've made about him based on his appearance. What you did was unprofessional and, frankly, inexcusable." Karen opened her mouth again, her face flushed with panic. She wanted to apologize, but her pride wouldn't let her. She couldn't admit that she had made a mistake, not like this. Not in front of someone who clearly had the power to ruin her life. She stood there, frozen, her mind racing for something to say, something that could make it all go away. But Marcus wasn't finished. "You're lucky I'm not pulling you off this flight right now," he continued. "But I will be speaking with your supervisors as soon as we land. I want you to understand what you've done here, and I want you to know that this isn't going to end with a simple apology." Karen's stomach dropped. The reality of the situation was hitting her all at once. The boy's father wasn't just any businessman. This was the CEO of the airline she worked for. And he wasn't someone she could intimidate, not someone who would let her off the hook with a few empty words. She was in deep trouble, and she knew it. But even as the seconds ticked by, and as the weight of her actions began to crush her, there was still a part of her that refused to fully comprehend the consequences of what she had done. What would happen to her now? Would she be fired? Would she lose her job? Would she ever work in the airline industry again? As the silence stretched between them, Marcus took one last look at Karen, his eyes cold and unwavering. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, before turning and walking back down the aisle. The tension in the cabin hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had only grown thicker, and as the flight continued toward its destination, everyone knew that this story was far from over. As Marcus returned to his seat, he couldn't shake the image of his son's face from his mind. Xavier had always been a quiet kid, thoughtful and observant. He rarely showed emotion, especially in public. But today, after what had happened, Marcus could see the subtle tremble in his son's hands as he tried to hold his tablet steady. It wasn't just about the slap, it was everything that came before it and everything that would follow. The world was a difficult place for people like Xavier, and Marcus was doing his best to prepare him for that harsh reality, but this was a moment that felt like a crushing blow to everything they had worked toward. Xavier looked up at him again, his eyes wide and searching. Marcus wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but the weight of the situation was too much. He knew that, as much as he could comfort his son in private, this was going to be something much bigger. It was going to be a statement, a lesson for not just the flight attendant, but for everyone who had ever made assumptions based on the color of someone's skin. The quiet hum of the engines was the only sound for a long while, but then, Marcus noticed something strange. The passengers around them, those who had witnessed the incident, were no longer focused on their own activities. Instead, they were whispering to each other, eyes flicking between him and the flight attendants. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, a tension hanging over the group, as though the entire flight had become a waiting room for something unknown. Everyone was wondering, what would happen next? In the back of the plane, Karen was trying to pull herself together. She had retreated to the staff area, but even there, she couldn't escape the gnawing anxiety building inside her. She knew she had crossed a line. Slapping a child, especially the child of the CEO, was a career-ending mistake. She could feel her job slipping away, but it was more than that. It was her dignity, her place in the airline, everything she had worked for. She had always been the kind of person who thought of herself as good-natured and fair-minded. But looking back, she realized how often her judgments had been clouded by assumptions. She thought she had seen this child for who he was, a spoiled, entitled brat. In truth, she hadn't seen him at all. The guilt was starting to settle in, deep and uncomfortable. Karen had always prided herself on her ability to handle passengers with patience and professionalism. She had been promoted to this role because of her dedication and work ethic, but now she wondered how much of that had been built on the idea that some passengers deserved more respect than others. People like Marcus Carter, for example, people with power, money, and influence. And then there were people like Xavier, people she had dismissed too quickly. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the employee directory, her eyes scanning for the names of her supervisors. She wasn't sure if she wanted to call them or avoid them altogether. But she couldn't hide from the reality of what had happened. The flight wouldn't end with a simple apology. She had crossed a line, and now, she would have to face the consequences. The thought of losing her job was terrifying, but even worse was the thought of facing Marcus Carter. The man who held the future of this airline in his hands. How could she make this right? Was it even possible? Back in the cabin, Marcus was sitting next to Xavier, trying his best to be the calming presence his son needed, but even he could feel the heat of the situation growing. There were whispers, sideways glances, and even a few passengers who were clearly eavesdropping on their quiet conversation. The whole plane felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something dramatic to happen. And Marcus knew it wasn't just about what had happened on this flight anymore, it was about something bigger. He had worked his whole life to make Carter Airlines a place where all people, no matter their background, felt respected. He had championed diversity initiatives, fought for better representation in the industry, and built a culture of inclusion that he believed was central to the company's success. But now, in the face of this public humiliation, he couldn't help but wonder if all his efforts had been in vain. Was this a reflection of the company he had built, or was it a one-off mistake? The fact that it was happening in his own company, under his watch, made it feel even worse. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his son. It was about showing Xavier that standing up for yourself didn't just mean confronting your bullies. It meant calling out those in positions of power who thought they could get away with injustice. As a father, Marcus had always wanted Xavier to be confident, to know that he was worthy of respect. But now, the lesson had become a painful one. Marcus knew he had to act, but the right course of action wasn't clear. The moment could go in so many different directions. There was still the rest of the flight to get through, and neither Marcus nor Karen knew that their lives were about to intersect in a way neither of them could have predicted. For the passengers on board, this was just another flight. But for Marcus, it had become a battleground. He couldn't let it slide. He had to make a decision, and soon. He couldn't let his son's dignity be forgotten, and he couldn't let Karen's mistake go unaddressed. But in the midst of the storm, there was one passenger who had been watching the situation unfold with keen interest. Olivia, a frequent flyer, had been watching the exchange closely from a few rows back. She had seen what had happened when Karen slapped the boy, and her blood had boiled in that instant. But as the flight wore on, Olivia couldn't help but feel a strange sense of empathy for Karen. It was clear the flight attendant had made a horrible mistake, but there was something in her eyes, something that told Olivia she wasn't entirely heartless. She wasn't excusing the slap, not by any means, but she knew that in the right circumstances, people could change. Olivia's thoughts were racing. She had worked for a major PR firm for years and understood the power of public perception. She had seen countless scandals unfold in the media, and she knew how easily a small mistake could spiral out of control if handled poorly. She had witnessed big companies fall, and small mistakes turn into irreversible damage. Was this going to be one of those moments? Or could there be a way for Karen to make amends? Olivia's mind was set. She was going to approach Marcus. After all, she had an insider's perspective, and maybe she could help navigate the storm that was brewing. She wasn't looking to minimize the wrong that had been done, but she knew how to help people come out the other side. Olivia knew that if this issue wasn't handled carefully, it would dominate the headlines for weeks. And the fallout for the airline could be catastrophic. The plane continued to soar through the sky, the turbulence of the moment mirrored by the tension in the cabin. Everyone knew the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. What would Marcus decide? Would Karen be given the chance to make things right, or would her career be permanently derailed? How would this moment shape the future of Carter Airlines? The answers were still up in the air, and nobody knew what would happen next. But one thing was certain. This was just the beginning. The final stretch of the flight felt like an eternity. The hum of the engines was a constant presence, but it did nothing to soothe the growing unease in the cabin. It wasn't just the passengers who were feeling the tension. Even the flight crew seemed on edge. The rest of the staff had retreated to their quarters, away from the prying eyes of the passengers, but their nervous glances, the hushed conversations, told a story of their own. Everyone knew that something big was unfolding, something that could change the course of the airline's reputation forever. Marcus sat in his seat, still keeping a watchful eye on Xavier, who was now staring out the window, his face a mask of quiet contemplation. Despite his earlier confidence, Marcus could feel his own thoughts racing. He had been in countless high-pressure situations before, meetings with investors, media interviews, difficult negotiations, but nothing felt as heavy as this. This was about his son, about what kind of man he was going to raise him to be, and about what kind of company he was leading. Could he really let this slide? Could he just move on from the slap and pretend it wasn't a reflection of the deeper issues that existed in the company? Or would this be the moment that he took a stand, not just for his son, but for everything he had built? The plane continued its journey across the sky, the bright lights of the city far below now blending with the inky blackness of the night. Passengers had begun to settle back into their routines, but the air was still thick with anticipation. No one was sure how it would play out. Would the situation remain a minor altercation, or would it escalate into something far more dangerous? At the back of the plane, Karen stood in the small galley, her hands gripping the counter as though it might anchor her to something solid. Her mind was spinning. What had she been thinking? She had acted out of anger, out of frustration, but the moment the slap had landed, everything had shifted. The seconds afterward had been a blur, and now, standing here, she realized she had no idea how to fix it. The flight was nearing its end, and she knew that Marcus wasn't going to let it go. She couldn't escape the reality that she had ruined everything, her career, her future, all of it. Even if she apologized, even if she begged for forgiveness, she wasn't sure it would make any difference. What kind of person did that to a child? What kind of person did that to his child? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind her. Olivia, the passenger who had been watching the whole exchange, appeared at the galley, her eyes calm but determined. Karen turned, startled, and for a moment, she felt herself instinctively bristle, unsure of what this stranger was going to say. But Olivia's demeanor was different. She wasn't angry. There was no judgment in her gaze, just understanding. "Can I speak to you for a moment?" Olivia asked, her voice low but firm. Karen hesitated. She didn't want to hear anyone's opinions right now, certainly not from someone who had no idea what it felt like to lose everything in an instant. But something in Olivia's eyes made her pause. Maybe it was the calmness that contrasted so sharply with the panic rising inside her. Maybe it was the strange sense of compassion that Olivia exuded. "I'm listening," Karen said, her voice barely a whisper. Olivia stepped a little closer, lowering her voice. "I saw what happened, and I know what you're going through. I've been there before. Making a mistake is one thing, but facing the consequences? That's a whole other thing." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of Olivia's words, felt the raw truth in them. Olivia wasn't trying to excuse what had happened, but she wasn't condemning her either. It was the kind of perspective Karen needed, even if she hadn't known she wanted it. Olivia continued, "But you need to be careful. The moment this flight lands, the press will be all over this. And Marcus Carter? He's not just some CEO. He's a force. If you don't handle this right, it could be the end of your career." The mention of Marcus Carter's name made Karen's stomach churn. The last thing she wanted was to face him again, to have to answer for what she had done. But she couldn't just keep running. She had to face it, even if it meant losing everything. "I don't know what to do," Karen admitted, her voice breaking for the first time. "I never thought it would escalate like this. I never thought I'd." Olivia gave her a small, almost sympathetic smile. "It's not too late, but you have to act fast. He's already angry. You've got one chance to make it right." Karen nodded slowly. There was nothing else to do. She couldn't fix what had already been done, but maybe she could somehow make amends. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Meanwhile, Marcus was sitting in his seat, his thoughts swirling. The plane was beginning its descent, and with it, the reality of the situation was becoming more urgent. He had made his decision. He was going to confront the airline's executives once the plane landed. He wasn't going to let this slide. But something kept pulling at him. Was this the right time? Would an apology be enough, or did something deeper need to change within his company? He glanced over at Xavier again. His son was still staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Xavier hadn't spoken much since the incident, and that silence spoke volumes. Marcus knew he had to do more than just stand up for his son in front of the flight attendant. He had to stand up for the kind of world he wanted to create, for his son, for his company, for everyone. But what did that look like? As the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, the tension in the air was palpable. Every moment seemed to stretch on forever. Passengers began gathering their belongings, some chatting quietly, others avoiding eye contact with each other, all aware that something big had happened, but unsure of how it would play out. Karen stood at the back of the cabin, her eyes fixed on the door as if willing the flight to come to a close. She knew she couldn't hide from what was coming. Marcus was going to make his move, and she would have to face the music. But there was still a final moment before the plane fully landed, one last chance for both of them to take action. What would happen once the wheels hit the tarmac? Would Marcus follow through with his promises? Would Karen find a way to salvage what was left? The countdown to the end was almost over, and the stakes had never been higher. The plane had finally touched down on the runway, the wheels screeching slightly as they made contact with the tarmac, signaling that the flight was over. But for Marcus and Karen, the real turbulence was only just beginning. Passengers began to unbuckle their seat belts and gather their things. but there was no escaping the storm that was building inside the cabin. The soft murmur of voices grew louder, but it was the silence between Marcus and his son that spoke the loudest. Xavier had barely moved, still staring blankly out of the window, his eyes distant. Marcus could feel the tension rising, every muscle in his body tense, ready for the inevitable confrontation. He had spent years building his company, but now it seemed as though everything he had worked for was hanging in the balance, all because of one moment. A single decision made by a flight attendant who had thought she could act without consequence. And yet, that wasn't the only thing weighing on his mind. Olivia's warning echoed in his thoughts. If you don't handle this right, it could be the end of your career. She was right. Marcus wasn't just a father here, he was a CEO, and his actions would speak volumes to everyone who watched this unfold. The moment they landed was the moment everything would change. As the flight attendants began to move about, preparing for disembarkation, Karen lingered in the galley, her nerves on edge. She was trying to steady her breathing, attempting to think through her next move. Should she just walk up to Marcus, apologize, and pray that he would show mercy? Or should she stand back and let him decide her fate, knowing that there was no coming back from this if it went south? She had no idea what was about to happen, but deep down, she felt a gnawing sense of dread, one that refused to let her relax for even a second. Just as the plane came to a full stop, and the seatbelt sign clicked off, a voice came over the intercom, breaking the fragile silence. Attention all passengers, thank you for flying with Carter Airlines. Please remain seated while the ground crew prepares for disembarkation. Marcus looked up, startled, at the sound of the announcement. He wasn't sure why it caught him off guard, but something about the tone of the voice, something in the delivery, made him feel uneasy. It wasn't just any flight attendant speaking. It was a voice he recognized, one he had heard many times before on company-wide announcements. The kind of voice that carried authority. His instincts kicked in. Before he could process it, he stood up, motioning for Xavier to follow him, his thoughts now racing in overdrive. He had to move quickly. There was something about this moment that felt off, like an invisible weight in the air, thickening by the second. As they made their way down the aisle, the flight attendants were busy with their duties, ushering passengers toward the exits, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this situation than just a flight gone wrong. Just as he reached the door, he saw the familiar face of Olivia approaching him. Her expression was hard to read, but there was a sense of urgency in her step, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. "Mr. Carter, there's something you need to know," Olivia said quietly, her voice just above a whisper, barely audible above the din of passengers. Marcus stopped, confused. "What is it?" Olivia hesitated for a moment, glancing at the other flight attendants and then back at him. "It's Karen. She's not just a flight attendant. She's more involved with the airline than you think." Marcus's brows furrowed in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "She's a flight attendant." Olivia's gaze dropped to the floor, her voice tense. "No, she's been working here for longer than most people realize. She's connected to someone high up in the company. A major investor. Someone who has been pulling strings behind the scenes. And she has more influence than anyone knows." For a moment, Marcus couldn't process what he was hearing. His mind spun, the walls closing in around him. Karen, the woman who had just slapped his son, wasn't just some random employee making a mistake. She was connected to someone powerful, someone with influence over his company, someone who could bring the entire situation crashing down in an instant. "Are you saying she's got someone backing her up? That she's been using her position to?" Marcus struggled to form the words, a sense of betrayal gnawing at him. Olivia nodded, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "It's bigger than just a bad decision. There's a network involved, and it goes all the way up." Marcus's head was spinning. The implications were impossible to ignore. If this was true, then everything had changed. What had seemed like a straightforward conflict, a simple case of a flight attendant making an unforgivable mistake, was suddenly a part of something far more dangerous. But there was no time to process it fully. Just as Marcus was about to ask more questions, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart sinking when he saw the name on the screen: Richard Stevens. Richard Stevens was one of the top investors in Carter Airlines. He had been a longtime ally and had supported Marcus through many of the company's most pivotal moments. But now, the fact that he was calling in the midst of this disaster made Marcus uneasy. Without thinking, he answered the phone, his voice low. "Richard," he said, trying to steady his nerves. "Marcus," Richard's voice came through the line, calm but clipped. "We need to talk. Now." The urgency in Richard's tone sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Something was wrong, and whatever it was connected to the mess he was already facing. He could feel the walls closing in, his chest tightening with each passing second. "I'm here on the plane. What's going on? Is this about the situation with Karen?" Marcus asked, the tension in his voice growing. "Not just that," Richard replied. "There's something you need to know about the situation with Karen, and the person who's really behind all of this. It's bigger than you think. Trust me when I say that you're about to find out things you aren't prepared for." Marcus's heart stopped. There was no time to waste. This wasn't just a mistake that could be fixed with an apology. This was a game changer, something that could reshape everything Marcus had built, and possibly destroy everything in its path. As he looked at Olivia, her face now mirroring the anxiety he felt deep inside, he knew that the stakes had just been raised. The situation was no longer just about Karen's career or his son's dignity. It was about the future of Carter Airlines itself, and the powerful forces pulling the strings behind the scenes. The plane door finally opened, but Marcus's feet felt rooted to the ground. He had to make a decision, but he had no idea what was waiting for him once he stepped off this plane. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus stood there, phone still pressed to his ear. Richard's words echoed in his mind, his pulse quickening with every passing second. Something wasn't right. The secrets surrounding Karen, the hidden network of power within the airline. Marcus knew that whatever lay ahead, it would be a life-altering moment. He had thought the worst of it had already happened. But now, with every step toward the exit of the plane, he could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down harder than ever. "Marcus," Richard's voice cut through the line again, this time tinged with urgency. "You need to listen carefully. You need to trust me. What you're about to find out could be the end of Carter Airlines. You have no idea who you're really dealing with." Marcus's hand tightened around the phone. "What do you mean? Is it Karen, or is it someone else? Tell me." There was a long pause on the other end. When Richard spoke again, his tone was low, almost like a whisper. "Karen isn't just an employee with connections. She's working directly for someone who has been trying to take down your empire for years. And the person backing her is someone much closer to you than you think." A cold chill shot through Marcus's spine. The world around him seemed to slow down, the reality of what Richard was saying sinking in. His mind raced. Who could it be? Who had the power to threaten everything he had built, everything he had worked so hard for? The flight attendants had now finished their preparations, and the doors to the plane had opened. Passengers were beginning to disembark, but Marcus stayed frozen, his mind caught in a whirlwind of thoughts. Olivia was standing beside him now, her face pale with concern. She must have heard Richard's voice from the phone, and she must have known that something had just shifted in the air. "Marcus, you need to move," Olivia urged, glancing anxiously toward the terminal. "If what Richard said is true, then you're running out of time." Marcus's eyes locked onto hers, his expression hardening. "Who could it be, Olivia?" he muttered under his breath. "Who has the power to destroy this company from the inside?" She hesitated, and in that moment, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of dread fill the space between them. Just then, the phone buzzed again. Richard was calling back. With trembling hands, Marcus answered. "What is it, Richard? What are you not telling me?" Richard's voice was laced with frustration. "It's your mother, Marcus. Your mother is the one pulling the strings. She's been secretly working to take over the company, to use Karen as a pawn to get rid of you. The entire plan, it's all been orchestrated from the very top." Marcus's head spun, the room around him spinning into a blur. His mother, the one person he had trusted above all others, was behind the scheme to destroy everything he had fought for? He could barely believe it. His mind raced to all the times she had supported him, all the advice she had given him. How could he have missed it? How could he have been so blind? "Are you sure about this, Richard?" Marcus's voice barely rose above a whisper. He could hardly bring himself to say the words. "Are you telling me my own mother has been working against me?" "Yes, Marcus," Richard replied, his voice grim. "She's been doing it for years. But Karen, she's just the final piece. She's the one who's been sent in to take you down once and for all." Marcus stood in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing on him like 100 tons. His hands trembled as he slowly disconnected the call. His mother had been behind everything. The slap, the scandal, the power plays within the company. And now, with everything he had worked so hard to build on the verge of crumbling, he was faced with a choice, one that would change his life forever. His gaze shifted to the plane door, where Karen stood, watching him from a distance. She looked different now, almost small, like the power she had once held was slipping away with every second. There was nowhere to run. No more avoiding the inevitable. He took a deep breath and turned to Olivia. "Get me to the terminal. We're confronting this head on." Now. Olivia didn't hesitate, leading him down the gangway and toward the waiting cars. The world felt like it was closing in, and each step forward only seemed to raise the stakes. As they reached the parking lot, Marcus saw Karen standing outside near a black car. She was waiting for him, her hands clenched at her sides, her expression unreadable. He approached her slowly, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he expected: anger, regret, fear, maybe even an apology. But what he saw when he reached her was nothing like he anticipated. There was no guilt, no sign of shame. She simply stood there, calm, as if she had already accepted whatever consequences might come. "Marcus," she began, her voice steady but cold, "I know what you're about to do. But let me tell you this. You've already lost." His anger flared, but he held it in check. "What do you mean, I've lost?" "Your mother's plan was never just about the company," she said, her voice softer now, almost pitying. "It was about you. She wanted to break you. She wanted to show you that even your own family could betray you. And guess what? She succeeded." Marcus's mind reeled. His mother had not only been orchestrating the downfall of his company but had been playing a game far more personal than he had ever imagined. A cold realization washed over him. This wasn't just about power. It was about revenge. Just then, a car pulled up beside them. The door opened, and to Marcus's shock, his mother stepped out. She was smiling, an eerie, knowing smile, as if she had won the game all along. "Hello, Marcus," she said. Her voice smooth and rehearsed. "It's time you knew the truth. Everything I did for you. To prepare you. Now, you'll see just how far you've come." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. This was it. His entire life, his career, his relationships, everything had been a pawn in his mother's twisted game. The final twist was nothing short of a nightmare. The woman he trusted most had been plotting his downfall all along, all while pretending to be his greatest supporter. With the truth laid bare before him, Marcus was left standing at the crossroads of his own life, wondering how he could ever rebuild what had been shattered. Would he overcome this betrayal, or would the weight of the conspiracy break him completely? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the air was thick as Marcus stood facing his mother, the woman who had spent years manipulating everything he thought he knew. Her smile was sharp, almost triumphant, and yet, as he looked into her eyes, something inside him hardened. The betrayal, the lies, the schemes, they all crashed down on him like a tidal wave, but somehow, he found clarity in that moment. He wasn't going to let this destroy him. He couldn't. "Why, Mom?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it held an edge of determination. "Why go this far? What was the point of all this?" His mother's smile remained as she took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You were always too soft, Marcus. Too trusting. I thought you needed to learn that the world doesn't play by your rules. People don't care about loyalty. They care about power. And I was just showing you how to claim it. To take what's yours." Marcus shook his head slowly. "You didn't teach me anything. You just used me. All this time, you've been playing a game, and I was too blind to see it." His mother's face twitched for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. "You don't understand, Marcus. I've always had to work twice as hard to get half as much. And I wanted better for you. I thought if I controlled everything, if I set up the right path, you'd see it too. You'd realize that nothing comes for free in this world." He could see the pain underneath her calculated words, the unspoken fears that had driven her actions. For years, she had tried to shape him, control him, because of the deep wounds from her own life. But Marcus wasn't going to let her mistakes dictate his future. "No, Mom, you were wrong," Marcus said firmly, his voice stronger now. "This isn't the way. You can't control everything, especially not me." The weight of his words seemed to linger in the air, as if challenging the very foundation of everything she had built. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a realization seemed to hit his mother. Her smile faded, and she turned her head, as though contemplating something, before looking back at Marcus with a softer expression. "I didn't want to destroy you," she said, almost regretfully. "But I wanted you to be strong. I wanted you to be prepared. I didn't know how to help you see the truth until it was too late." Marcus nodded slowly, the anger he had felt earlier dissipating somewhat. There was no use in continuing to fight her. The truth was, his mother had been broken long ago, and he couldn't let her brokenness consume him any longer. His journey wasn't about fighting her, it was about freeing himself. He glanced over at Karen, still standing a few steps away, her eyes downcast. She was just a pawn in all of this, an unwitting participant in his mother's schemes. For a moment, their eyes met, and Marcus saw something different in her gaze. Regret, shame, perhaps even a desire to escape from the web of lies that had ensnared her. But there was no way to undo what had already been done. "Karen," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm, "I don't know what's going to happen to you, but you need to understand that what you did, it's not something that can just be brushed aside. There will be consequences, but if you truly want to make things right, you need to walk away from this." Karen looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She knew the gravity of the situation. I never meant for it to go this far," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I was doing what was expected of me. But now, I don't know who I am anymore." Marcus gave a small, resigned sigh. None of us ever really know who we are until we're forced to face ourselves in the mirror. But the first step is always the hardest. Do the right thing now. With that, he turned back to his mother. She stood there, watching him closely, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, the weight of her years of manipulation hanging between them. Marcus wasn't sure if she would ever change, if she would ever see the damage she had caused. But he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to carry her burden anymore. "Take it all, Marcus," she said, her voice soft, almost defeated. "The company, the power, it's all yours now. But don't forget, you wouldn't have it if I hadn't made you strong enough to take it." He shook his head. "I don't need your version of strength, Mom. I'm going to do this my way. With integrity. I'll lead the company, but it's going to be different. I'm not going to rule by fear or manipulation." She looked at him, her eyes flickering with something that could have been pride, or maybe just a glimmer of acceptance. "We'll see, Marcus. You'll see what it takes to keep it all. The world doesn't let you play fair." Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't interested in her warnings anymore. The truth was, he had already won. He had seen through the lies, and now he was ready to take control of his own future. As he turned away, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The past had been heavy, filled with pain, manipulation, and deceit. But now, it was behind him. His future was his to shape, and he wouldn't let anyone, least of all his mother, stand in his way. Marcus stepped toward the car, his mind already racing with the possibilities of what came next. There were still questions to be answered. There were still scars to heal, both within the company and in his own heart. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Ready to move forward, to rebuild what had been broken, and to make sure that his legacy was something built on trust, respect, and honesty. As the car pulled away, Marcus glanced back one last time. His mother and Karen were still standing there, but they were no longer his focus. He had done what needed to be done. The rest was up to them. The city skyline loomed in the distance, full of possibilities. And as the sun dipped low in the sky, Marcus knew that this chapter of his life had come to a close. But the story was far from over. His journey was just beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But he was ready to walk it on his own terms.